The night it happened, the desert air was still hot enough to feel like a hair dryer on my neck, even past midnight. I remember staring at my living room window, watching headlights sweep across the stucco walls, and thinking, who in their right mind runs a towing blitz at this hour? Because that's exactly what it was, a fast, silent sweep down our street, like a surprise raid, and my guests' cars were the targets. Here's the hook: you're probably already yelling at your screen. Can a single midnight towing spree, plus a $350 release fee per car, spiral into a full-blown neighborhood rebellion before Monday's board meeting even starts? Yeah. It can. And in my case, it did, in a way I didn't even plan at first. I'm not the kind of person who hunts for conflict. I moved out here for space, sun, and quiet. The kind of quiet where the loudest thing at night is the software of someone's AC unit kicking on, or the distant bark of a dog that's too stubborn to sleep. I wanted a calm life. I wanted my family to visit on weekends, park on the curb like everybody else does, and spend time together without any suburban politics. But our neighborhood had a different definition of calm. Calm here meant compliance. Calm meant one specific voice always getting its way. Calm meant that if a rule existed in the thick, dusty binder of community regulations, it could be used like a weapon whenever someone felt like swinging it. And I didn't know I was in that kind of place until the towing started. The wild part is, no one warned my guests. No friendly note. No, hey, just so you know, overnight parking is a problem. Nothing. Just a tow truck sliding in like a shadow, and then, gone. The thing I felt first wasn't anger. It was confusion. Like, wait, are we seriously doing this right now? Over street parking? Overnight? In a neighborhood where half the houses are empty during the summer because people travel to escape the heat? Then I saw the orange sticker left behind on the pavement, flapping a little in the hot breeze like some kind of cruel flag. It had a case number, a timestamp, and a line that made my stomach drop: violation, overnight street parking. Vehicle removed. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a mistake. It was a message. And by morning, I'd have a $350 fee staring me in the face, per car. I didn't know yet that the towing was about to drag an entire committee into the sunlight, or that my neighbors were already simmering, ready to explode if someone gave them the match. I didn't know that by the next family weekend, the calm our board loved so much would start cracking like dry dirt after a monsoon warning. But I did know one thing: whoever decided to tow my guests at midnight had no idea what kind of chain reaction they just started. By the time I moved into this desert suburb, I thought I had the place figured out. It's one of those master-planned communities with curved streets, xeriscaped yards, and that pastel sand color palette that makes everything look like it grew out of the ground. In the afternoon, the light is so bright it feels white, and at dusk the mountains turn purple like someone spilled ink across the horizon. Most people here are polite in that surface-level way. They wave. They compliment your mailbox. They ask if you're surviving the heat, and then they go back inside to their cool air and their routines. The association runs the basics: landscaping, common areas, pool hours, and the endless list of neighborhood rules. The rules were the first clue that this place had a particular personality. When I got my welcome packet, it was thicker than my college textbooks. I'm not exaggerating. It had everything from paint color codes to curtain guidelines to what kind of gravel counted as approved desert rock. It even had a section about visual harmony that basically said your yard should not look too different from your neighbors, no matter how creatively you might want to live. At first, I shrugged it off. That's just how these communities are, right? A little overly organized. A little, we're protecting property values. The usual homeowners association drama you hear about online but hope you'll never deal with. And to be fair, the first few months were fine. Boring, even. I'd water my drought-tolerant plants, wipe the dust off the windows, and watch the neighborhood move at that slow, heat-weighted pace desert life forces on you. Then I started noticing the board. The committee itself wasn't huge, just a handful of people who had been around forever and treated the neighborhood like their personal project. Meetings were monthly, held in the clubhouse. The agenda got emailed out in cheery little bullet points. But the vibe was not cheery. Not if you paid attention. There was a board president, who I'll call the chair. Older, sharp, and always dressed like he expected a camera crew to show up. He spoke in that clipped, official tone like he was the mayor of a tiny kingdom. Then there was the treasurer, who acted like every blade of grass was coming out of her own bank account. She was the kind of person who could spot a non-compliant doormat from 50 feet away. And then there was the enforcer energy, the self-appointed rule guardian who wasn't technically security but sure acted like it. I'm calling her Miss K. Not because she's a cartoon villain. Because that's genuinely the vibe she gave, someone who believed rules were sacred, and anyone who questioned them was a threat to civilization. Miss K had a favorite move. She'd show up at meetings with a little folder of printed screenshots. A neighbor's trash bin out 5 minutes late. Someone's patio umbrella visible above their wall. A car parked half a tire over the painted curb line in a guest bay. Every complaint was delivered like evidence in a courtroom. She would slide a page onto the table, tap it twice, and let the silence do the rest. At first, I found it kind of funny. Like, wow, you really made this your whole personality. But I didn't feel exposed. I wasn't on her radar. I kept my place tidy, followed the big rules, and minded my own business. The parking rules were in the packet, sure. Everyone knew street parking overnight was discouraged, especially on narrow stretches near cul-de-sacs. But discouraged isn't banned. Discouraged is a warning. Discouraged is a polite suggestion. The actual rule language was vague. Something like, overnight street parking may be subject to enforcement to preserve access and safety. Not will be. May be. And it didn't say towing was automatic. It didn't mention fees. It didn't mention a patrol going full action movie at midnight. The board had never, in my experience, made it a big deal. People parked on the street all the time, especially when family visited. I'd seen it on every block. So when my family started coming out for weekends, my cousin and his partner, sometimes my aunt, once my childhood best friend on a road trip, I didn't even think twice. They'd pull in late Friday, park along the curb, and we'd go inside to eat, laugh, and decompress. That first family weekend after I moved in. A breeze. We made breakfast early, watched the sun rise gold over the pale walls, took a walk before the heat hit hard, and wrapped the night up with that gentle lazy feeling you get when life is good. Nothing about that weekend told me I was about to become the neighborhood's main storyline. But about a month later, I got a final notice on my door. The paper was bright white against the tan stucco, and the desert wind had pushed one corner up so it was fluttering like a warning flag. It was dated May 12th and stamped with the committee seal, the kind of stamp that screams, "We're serious because we bought a stamp." The notice wasn't about parking. It was about my side gate. Apparently the latch I had installed didn't match the approved hardware list. The funny thing? I'd installed the same latch a dozen other homes had. I could walk around the corner and point at 3 identical ones. But word for word, the notice said I had 10 days to correct it or face penalties. That was my first real clue that enforcement here wasn't about consistency. It was about attention. Someone was looking. And once you were looked at, you stayed in the spotlight. I replaced the latch. I didn't want friction. I told myself that was the end of it. A few days later, at the next meeting, I saw Miss K holding that same kind of folder, eyes scanning the room with the confidence of someone who never loses an argument because she never admits one exists. Still, I didn't connect myself to her. I was just a neighbor. I was calm. I was compliant. Then summer rolled in, hotter and brighter, and my family weekend tradition became a thing. Not loud parties. Not chaos. Just family. A couple cars on the street from Friday night to Sunday morning, always gone before the week began. That's when the guard showed up. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't city security. He was a private patrol guy hired by the association, driving a white SUV with a logo on the door and amber lights on top. A lot of neighborhoods hire someone like that to check gates, handle minor issues, and do a loop at night. Most of us barely noticed him, until he started parking at the street entrance around 10 p.m., watching like he was waiting for something. At first, I thought he was just bored. Maybe he liked the quiet. Maybe he was killing time. Then I noticed he'd slow down whenever he passed a car parked along the curb. Not stopping. Just rolling slowly, headlights washing over license plates like a scanner. It was subtle. It would have been easy to miss if I hadn't been sitting on my porch one late night, listening to the low buzz of insects and the soft hiss of distant sprinklers in the stillness. The next morning, I heard from 2 houses down that someone's uncle's car had been ticketed overnight. Not towed, just ticketed. A warning slip in the windshield. Okay, I thought. That's annoying, but maybe a one-off. Then another neighbor mentioned their guest got a warning too, on a Saturday night. Still no towing. Still no big public warning from the board. No email blast. No meeting note. Just warnings. Quiet pressure. Like someone was testing the water. I didn't realize that the patrol guy was basically a new instrument Miss K had decided to play. And I definitely didn't realize my house, because of those family weekends, was about to become his favorite stop. The weekend it blew up started like any other. The heat was heavy even in the morning, and the sky was that polished, endless blue that makes you feel small. My cousin rolled in late Friday. My aunt came a little after that. 2 cars. Both parked on the curb in front of my place, neat and respectful, nowhere near a hydrant, nowhere near a driveway, leaving space for anybody to pass. I remember noticing how normal it looked. How boring it was. We spent the evening inside, doors closed against the heat, catching up, letting the desert night turn cool in that slow, stubborn way it does. I wasn't checking out the street. I wasn't thinking about patrols. I wasn't thinking about rules. Because why would I? Around 11 p.m., I saw pale headlights sweep over the blinds, quick and casual. Then I heard the low rumble of an engine idling for a beat before moving on. I assumed it was just the patrol guy doing his loop. If I'd known what he was actually doing, I would have walked out there and taken a picture. I would have started documenting things right then. But I didn't. I went to sleep like a normal person who thinks their neighborhood is normal. Sometime after midnight, the towing blitz started. I didn't hear the hook. I didn't hear the chains. The desert is quiet, but not silent, and tow trucks are surprisingly good at being stealthy when they want to be. The whole process must have been fast, because when I woke up early to make coffee and step outside into the brittle morning light, the curb was empty. At first, I thought my cousin had taken the car for donuts. Maybe my aunt had gone for a sunrise drive. Then I saw their faces when they came out, confused, keys in hand, scanning the street. That's when the reality hit. No cars. No note on my door. No email. Just, gone. On the pavement near where the tires had been, there was that orange violation sticker. The one with the case number, the time, and a line that said the vehicle was removed for overnight street parking. My skin went cold even though the air was already warming up. I crouched to read it again, like maybe I'd misunderstood. Like maybe it would say, warning, if I blinked hard enough. It didn't. I pulled out my welcome packet, flipped to the parking section, and read it 3 times. The rule didn't say towing was mandatory. It didn't say guests would be removed without notice. It didn't even say overnight street parking was prohibited in absolute terms. It said, subject to enforcement. That word was suddenly doing a lot of work. My cousin was trying to be chill about it, but I could see the math happening behind his eyes. My aunt was already nervous, because to her, a tow feels like a crisis. And to me, it felt like a slap. We called the number on the sticker. The release fee was $350 per vehicle, plus storage. Payable before pickup. No exceptions. No discussion. 2 cars. The total bill crossed $700 before breakfast. I want you to understand how insane that felt in context. This wasn't a gated downtown condo with limited parking. This wasn't a crowded city block. This was a desert suburb with wide, empty streets and half the driveways long enough to land a small plane in. There was no safety emergency. No blocked access. No hazard. It was just enforcement for enforcement's sake. And someone had chosen the harshest tool right out of the gate. The patrol guy didn't even have the nerve to knock. He didn't leave a warning on the windshield. He didn't give anyone a chance to move the cars. He called a truck and let it do the talking. When I drove my cousin to the tow yard to get his car back, the sun was already biting down hard, bright on the windshield like a spotlight. My hands were tight on the steering wheel. I kept replaying the moment in my head, the SUV rolling by, the amber lights, the quiet, deliberate choice to tow. At the yard, everything was fast and transactional. I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene. Not because I wasn't furious. But because something in me had switched into observer mode. If this was the new standard, I needed to see how they were playing it. We paid. We got the cars back. We went home. And the whole time, I was thinking about that final notice from May 12th. Thinking about Miss K with her folder. Thinking about how the patrol guy suddenly cared about street parking when he hadn't 2 months ago. It wasn't random. It was directed. That Saturday afternoon, I took a walk through the neighborhood. The air smelled like hot asphalt and sun-baked creosote. I wasn't snooping. I was looking. And what I saw made my jaw tighten. There were cars on the street everywhere. Not a ton, but enough to make it obvious the rule wasn't being applied evenly. I saw a pickup parked overnight in front of a house near the corner. I saw a sedan tucked along a curb by the park. I saw a couple SUVs in a guest bay that clearly hadn't moved since yesterday. No orange stickers. No empty spots. No sign of towing. So my guests got hit, but others didn't. Which meant one of two things. Either I'd been extremely unlucky or someone was targeting my house because it was convenient, visible, and, most importantly, repeatable. I went home, pulled up the committee's last emailed agenda, and scanned the bullet points. There was a line from the previous month that I'd ignored at the time: Parking Compliance Initiative, Discussion and Enforcement Update. That told me everything. They had voted on a compliance initiative. And then decided not to tell us how they planned to enforce it. Maybe they thought a couple surprise tows would scare the neighborhood into behaving. Maybe they thought nobody would push back. Maybe they thought I'd just swallow the bill and keep my head down. They didn't know my family weekends were basically my one sacred tradition out here. They didn't know I'd quietly take a hit, and then start paying attention. And they definitely didn't know how many other neighbors were about to find out they weren't safe either. Before Monday's meeting, the board had a deadline in their heads: crush overnight parking fast, quietly, and make an example out of a few houses. What they didn't realize is that deadlines cut both ways, because once people realized the committee was willing to tow without warning, the countdown to a backlash had already started. That night, after my family went to bed, I sat at my kitchen table with the rule packet spread open like a map. The light from the overhead fixture felt harsh and lonely against the dark windows. I reread the parking section, then the enforcement section, then the fine schedule. There was a clause buried in the enforcement page that said violations should follow a progressive ladder unless there was an immediate safety issue. Warning first. Notice second. Penalties third. Severe action last. I underlined it. Because we had skipped straight to severe action, without a safety issue. I took a picture. Then another. Then I started a folder in my phone labeled parking. I wasn't planning revenge yet. I was planning clarity. If I walked into that Monday meeting heated, emotional, throwing accusations, they'd tune me out. That's how boards like this survive: they frame passion as irrational and rules as neutral. So I wanted receipts. Calm, boring receipts. The next morning, Sunday, I checked the street early. More cars had parked overnight. Still nothing happened. At noon, I got a text from my neighbor across the way, someone I'd barely talked to besides wave hellos. She asked if I knew why a patrol guy was taking pictures of cars last night. I told her what happened to my guests. She sent back a shocked reaction and said her sister was coming next weekend and she had nowhere else to park. That was the first little crack in the wall. Then another neighbor messaged me on the community app, asking if I'd heard about a tow on the next block. Then another. By Sunday evening, it felt like a low buzz moving under the surface of the neighborhood, like electricity before a storm that never quite arrives in the desert but always threatens to. People were comparing notes. People were getting nervous. People were getting mad. And the board? The board was silent. No email. No explanation. No, hey neighbors, heads up, we're enforcing overnight street parking now, here are the rules, here's what to do. Silence is a strategy. It lets you hit hard and then pretend you did nothing wrong because nobody can point to a promise you made. But silence also has a weakness. It leaves space for the truth to spread faster than your narrative. That's when I realized Monday's meeting wasn't just going to be about me. It was going to be about the entire neighborhood deciding whether we were okay living under surprise punishment. I looked at the calendar. I looked at the rule packet. I looked at my evidence photos. And I thought, okay. If they want a compliance initiative, they're about to learn what real community compliance looks like, when the community isn't complying with them anymore. Monday came in hot the way desert Mondays always do, like the week itself was already irritated. The sunrise was a hard line of light over the rooftops, and the air smelled faintly of warm dust and fresh-cut gravel from some yard crew down the street. I walked into the clubhouse that evening with a folder tucked under my arm and a calm face I did not feel. The meeting room was the same beige, over-air-conditioned space where time goes to flatten out. Folding chairs, a long table up front, and a little microphone that always made the chair sound like he was broadcasting from a bunker. The board members sat in their usual spots, stiff-backed and self-satisfied. Miss K was already there, closer to the table than the rest of us, her folder on her lap like a pet that needed feeding. I sat toward the middle. Not front row. Not hiding. Right in that line where you can see everything and still look like an ordinary neighbor. The chair called the meeting to order and started running through the agenda. Pool gate repairs. Landscaping bids. Some complaint about a mailbox that wasn't the approved shade of bronze. The usual tiny kingdom stuff. The air conditioner hummed so loud it felt like it was trying to drown out reality. Then the chair got to the line item that had caused this whole week to tilt sideways. Parking compliance initiative. Enforcement update. He said it like a routine checkbox. Like we were talking about trash pickup schedules, not towing people in the dark. He explained that overnight street parking had been a recurring issue, and that enforcement had been increased to protect access and safety. He used words like community standards and visibility. The treasurer nodded along. Miss K sat very still, eyes bright. There was a pause where he expected us to swallow it. I raised my hand. My heart was hammering, but my voice came out steady. I told them my guests had been towed on Saturday with zero warning, and that the fee had been $350 per car. I said I'd reviewed the regulations and enforcement ladder, and towing without notice didn't line up with progressive enforcement unless there was a safety emergency. The chair leaned forward like he was about to be reasonable, but his tone stayed icy. He basically said that the patrol was within their rights, that the rules had been distributed to all homeowners, and that guests are expected to follow them. He also said that warnings had been given community-wide. I asked where. Because I never received anything. He gave a vague gesture toward the committee's ongoing communication channels. So, in other words, nowhere specific. I could feel the room shifting. The neighbor beside me, someone I only knew as the guy who always walked his dog at night, muttered something under his breath. Another woman in the back sat up straighter. I pulled out my printed evidence and set it on my lap. The enforcement clause I'd underlined. The agenda excerpt. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I asked a simple question: if overnight parking is now a towable offense, why weren't homeowners told clearly and in writing, and why were some houses being enforced while others weren't? Miss K finally moved. She tilted her head like I'd asked why the sun was hot. She said the rule was old, and everyone knows it. She suggested that inconsistency was probably because people weren't learning, and that my guests were unlucky. Unlucky. Like the tow truck was a lightning bolt. Like it wasn't a human decision aimed at certain cars on certain streets. I looked around and waited. The chair tried to move on. He said they'd review communication and monitor enforcement. That kind of empty promise that's supposed to sound like a concession. And maybe it would have worked, if I had been the only person affected. But then a man stood up near the side wall. He said his brother's truck had been towed 2 weeks prior. Same fee. Same midnight sweep. No warning. Then another neighbor raised her hand. Her visiting parents had gotten warning slips the weekend before, and she asked why warnings were apparently random. Another person chimed in, saying the patrol guy had been taking photos of cars on their block but hadn't towed anyone there. In 5 minutes, the cozy board narrative was getting punched full of holes. The chair kept trying to frame it as residents not reading the rules, but at some point the room stopped buying it. You could hear it in the small sounds, chairs shifting, low murmurs building like wind under a door. And here's the part that felt surreal to me, Miss K looked almost thrilled. She wasn't embarrassed by the chaos. She loved it. It was drama that proved her world mattered. The chair ended the discussion by saying enforcement would continue, and that anyone with concerns should submit them through the proper channels. Proper channels. I wrote that phrase in my notes. Underlined it twice. Because I knew then that proper channels were about to be exactly what I used, just not the way he thought. After the meeting broke, the air outside felt like stepping into an oven someone had already baked anger in. The parking lot lights threw pale halos onto the asphalt, and people clustered in little groups, talking faster than usual, voices turning sharp. This was the real meeting. The board portion was theater. The afterpart is where neighborhoods decide who they are. I didn't have to run around recruiting anyone. They came to me, one by one, like gravity had shifted in my direction. A woman with sun-faded hair asked what the fee was again, and I told her. She said her college kid would be home for winter break soon and she couldn't afford surprise towing. The dog walker guy asked if towing was even legal without notice. I told him I wasn't here to give legal advice, I was just telling him what the rule packet said about warnings. Someone else said the patrol guy had been weirdly aggressive lately, making loops at 1 a.m. and spotlighting cars. Then a man in a baseball cap leaned in and said something that made my entire focus sharpen. He said the patrol wasn't acting on his own, he'd overheard the chair talking about making examples during a pool maintenance visit last month. Making examples. That was the vibe I'd been feeling but couldn't prove. I thanked him. I didn't press for more. I didn't want to turn this into gossip. I wanted it to stay a pattern of facts. By the time I got home, I had 3 text threads going with neighbors who wanted to compare notes. One offered to send me photos of a tow sticker they'd gotten. Another said she'd check her emails to see if any warning was ever sent. I opened my laptop, the blue light harsh against the dark kitchen. I drafted a simple timeline. No emotion, just dates and events. Saturday early morning, 2 guest cars towed. $350 each release fee. No warning. May 12th, final notice about my gate latch, proving I'm on enforcement radar. Last month agenda, parking compliance initiative. No subsequent communication. Progressive enforcement clause, warnings required absent safety emergency. Then I added a new line called neighbor reports. 3 separate houses. 3 separate instances. Same pattern. This wasn't about my cars. It was about power. The theme snapped into focus so cleanly it almost made me laugh, abuse of authority disguised as community order. The board wasn't protecting safety, they were protecting control. Ms. K wasn't guarding rules, she was guarding status. I stared at the committee website. There was a tab for community updates, full of old pool flyers and a January memo about trash bins. Nothing about towing. Nothing about a crackdown. So the chair had lied when he said warnings were given community-wide. That's not a small thing. That's not a whoops. That's the moment a board stops looking like a group of volunteers and starts looking like a machine that expects blind obedience. I saved screenshots. Date stamped them. Labeled them. Quiet receipts. Then I did one more thing, I looked up the election schedule. Our bylaws required annual board ballots in late summer. Homeowners could nominate candidates by petition, and a certain number of signatures forced a special item onto the next agenda. I'd never cared about that section before. Most people don't. It's boring and feels distant, until suddenly it's the only lever you've got. I read it twice. Slowly. A petition needed 20% of homeowners to sign to require a vote on any proposed policy change or board action. That percentage wasn't huge. Especially not after a weekend like this. The next morning, a neighbor forwarded me a photo of her own tow notice. Same orange sticker. Same wording. Different date. And another neighbor sent a screenshot of an email chain they'd started with management last month complaining about the patrol guy ticketing guests without explanation. I added those to the folder. The evidence props were stacking up like stones in my pocket. Heavy, simple, undeniable. And I could feel something else stacking too, momentum. The kind that turns a personal annoyance into a community line in the sand. The board didn't give us long to cool down. That weekend, they doubled down. Friday night arrived with that soft desert glow, the sky turning peach behind the ridge line, and my house filled up again, this time with a different set of visitors. My sister came in from out of town, and a close friend of mine was staying over for a hiking trip. I'd warned them already. I told them to park in my driveway. We played driveway Tetris, squeezing vehicles into every legal inch. But there were 3 cars total, and my driveway only fit 2 without blocking the sidewalk. So the 3rd car went on the curb, right in front of my place again. I thought about leaving a note on the windshield, something like resident guest, compliant parking, but I didn't want to give the patrol guy a new excuse to mess with it. We kept things low-key. Dinner inside. Window blinds down. The air outside still warm enough to shimmer under the streetlight. Around 10:30 p.m., I heard that familiar slow roll. Tires on asphalt. Engine humming low. The patrol SUV eased past, amber lights off, headlights bright. It slowed. Then stopped. I watched through the crack of the blinds as the guard got out, walked up to the curb-parked car, and snapped photos with his phone. Not a warning slip. Not a tap on my door. Just photos. He got back in and drove away like he'd finished a task. My chest went tight. I went outside after he left, the night air dry and faintly metallic, and checked the car. Nothing on the windshield. No sticker. But I knew what those photos meant. A record. A target. A setup. I didn't sleep much. I woke up twice, listening for trucks. The neighborhood was quiet except for the soft rattle of wind in the Palo Verde tree. By sunrise, the car was still there. Untouched. Relief washed through me, until I noticed another car on our street had vanished. 2 houses down, a guest SUV that had parked late Friday was gone, leaving a shadowed rectangle of clean pavement behind. Orange sticker. Another tow. This time it wasn't me. But it might as well have been. What the board was doing felt less like enforcement and more like a psychological game. Tow 1. Leave another. Make it unpredictable enough that everyone stays anxious. It worked for about 24 hours. Then people got furious. A neighbor I'd barely spoken to before marched up my walkway around noon, the sun bright on her shoulders, and asked if I'd seen what happened to her boyfriend's car. She said they'd parked at 1 a.m., and by 5 a.m. it was gone. She'd called the tow yard in tears. She didn't want to cry in front of me. She tried to laugh it off. But she was so mad her hands were shaking. She asked what she could do. I told her I wasn't a lawyer, and I wasn't promising anything. But I asked her to email the committee through management and to keep the receipt. I also asked if she'd be willing to sign a petition when I had one ready. Her answer was instant. Yes. That afternoon, I got 3 more messages. 2 about towing. One about a warning slip that was dated after the car had already been removed, which meant the patrol guy was post-dating warnings to cover the board's tracks. I stared at that photo for a full minute, heat pulsing outside, AC blasting inside, my whole body buzzing with the kind of quiet rage that makes you calm in a dangerous way. This was starting to feel like an HOA nightmare, and I could tell the neighborhood was done pretending it was normal. So I started building the petition. Not a rant. Not a manifesto. A clean, one-page request to demand a vote on a parking enforcement moratorium until clear notice and consistent rules were provided. I attached 3 evidence items. The May 12 final notice showing progressive enforcement language applied to other violations. The agenda excerpt listing the Parking Compliance Initiative without any follow-up communications. A screenshot of the enforcement ladder clause requiring warnings absent safety emergency. I formatted it like something you'd hand to a city council. Boring on purpose. Then I printed 20 copies. And I grabbed a clipboard. I didn't go door to door like a politician. I moved like a neighbor who already knew where the anger lived. The sun was a white blaze overhead, and the sidewalk radiated heat through my shoes. Every few houses I'd stop in the sliver of shade a wall offered, take a sip of water, and then keep going. I started with the people who'd already reached out. They signed without hesitation. One guy joked that he'd sign twice if it meant the patrol guys stopped prowling at night. Then I hit the cul-de-sac where a tow had happened that morning. The homeowner there didn't even let me finish my first sentence before he took the clipboard. He was a quiet retiree type, but his eyes were on fire. He said he'd lived here 10 years and overnight street parking had always been handled with warnings. He said towing guests without notice was pure greed. That line stuck in my head, because this whole thing was cash. Let me be real, the board thought towing would be a money-saving compliance shortcut, but every surprise tow put more dollars at risk, not for them, for us. If a $350 fee can hit any driveway on any weekend, who's going to trust this committee with another budget vote or another year of control? That reframe was the key. People don't always mobilize over rules. But they mobilize over money, especially when it feels stolen in the dark. By late afternoon, I had more signatures than I needed. Not everyone agreed, but even the ones who didn't sign admitted the crackdown felt extreme. One woman said she loved strict rules because they kept things nice, but even she thought towing overnight without warning was too far. She didn't sign, but she thanked me for trying to make it fair. That's the thing about power abuse, it makes even rule lovers uncomfortable when it gets unpredictable. By evening, neighborhood group chats were lit up. People were posting tow yard receipts, photos of orange stickers, screenshots of the bylaws. Someone even posted a grainy doorbell video of a tow truck creeping by at 12:40 a.m. The committee still hadn't sent a single email. So we filled the silence for them. I scanned the signed petition, saved copies, and emailed it to management with a request to add it to the next agenda. I attached my evidence. I asked for confirmation of receipt. Then I waited. Not passively. Waiting with my eyes open. Because I knew they wouldn't take this politely. The chair and Ms. K had staked their authority on this crackdown. Backing down now would make them look weak. And people like that would rather escalate than admit they were wrong. Sure enough, Sunday night, a new community bulletin hit our inboxes. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a clarification. It was a reminder about parking rules, written in that stiff, scolding tone, and it added a new line in bold: overnight street parking will be subjected to immediate towing at owner's expense. Immediate. So they were changing the severity in real time, trying to legitimize what they'd already been doing. And they were doing it after the tows. I screenshot it. Added it to the folder. Then I read the timestamp. The email had been scheduled. Sent right after the patrol guy had already towed 2 more cars that night. This wasn't correction. It was cover. By now, guests across the neighborhood had been towed at midnight with $350 fees and no warning, while the board pretended it was routine enforcement. I gathered receipts, built a petition, and in one weekend got enough neighbors to demand a formal vote to stop the blitz. After that email, the mood changed from anger to something sharper. People weren't just mad about towing. They were mad about being played. On Monday, management replied to me with a bland confirmation that the petition had been received and would be placed on the agenda for the next monthly meeting. No promises. No commentary. But the fact it had to be on the agenda was already a win. That's what bylaws are for, forcing sunlight into rooms that prefer shadows. The chair didn't like sunlight. I know that because 2 days later, I got another notice on my door. Not about parking. About my trash bin being visible beyond approved hours on Tuesday morning. Tuesday. Not even a weekend. The photo they included had a timestamp, 7:02 a.m., and showed my bin sitting halfway behind my gate because I'd forgotten to roll it in before a work call. A tiny mistake, sure. But still another enforcement swipe. They were trying to overwhelm me with petty corrections. Make me feel watched. Make me tired. It would have worked a month ago. But now? It felt like confirmation I was doing the right thing. They only retaliate when they're worried. I didn't respond to that notice emotionally. I fixed the bin issue, filed the paper, and moved on. Meanwhile, neighbors kept forwarding me their own little enforcement hits. A warning for a car parked 2 inches too far into a guest spot. A courtesy notice about a planter in a front yard. The patrol guy was suddenly everywhere. They were trying to create a chilling effect. Instead, they were spreading fuel. By the end of that week, I had a growing list of homeowners telling me they wanted to vote the chair out in the summer election. Some were quiet about it, the way desert folks get when they've been burned before. Others were loud. One neighbor said she didn't even care about parking anymore, she cared that the board was making rules in secret. That was the heart of it. Nothing breaks community trust faster than selective enforcement plus backdated cover emails. I had to stay careful. I couldn't make this about personalities. I had to keep it about process, because that's how you beat a process-obsessed board. So I sent out a calm neighborhood update in the group chat. I summarized the petition's goal. I attached the bylaws section showing our right to demand a vote. I told everyone not to confront the patrol guy directly and to keep any receipts if they were towed. No threats. No drama. Just coordination. The chair must have seen it, because the next morning, he posted a statement in the app saying the board was disappointed to see misinformation and that towing was necessary to enforce standards. He didn't deny the lack of warnings. He didn't deny inconsistency. He just tried to shame anyone questioning him. That was his mistake. Because shame only works when people are alone. Once a group decides they're not embarrassed anymore, shame flips into solidarity. People started replying under his post, respectfully but firmly. They asked for written evidence of prior warnings. They asked why some cars were towed and others weren't. They asked why the patrol guy wasn't leaving notices before calling trucks. The chair went quiet after that. But Ms. K didn't. She replied in that sharp, polished way, accusing homeowners of wanting chaos. She said if we allowed street parking overnight, emergency vehicles wouldn't be able to pass. She said we were risking everyone's safety for convenience. It sounded scary until you looked at the actual streets. Our roads were wide enough for 2 SUVs to pass side by side even with cars on the curb. The emergency argument was theater. Still, I didn't debate her online. I didn't have to. Neighbors started posting photos of the street widths, measurements, and longtime residents saying overnight curb parking had never once caused a safety issue, only complaints from certain board members. Ms. K got ratioed without anyone raising their voice. That's community power, not loud, just undeniable. By the time the next meeting rolled around, still a couple weeks away, the committee had lost control of the narrative. Tow trucks were still doing their stealth loops, but fewer people were getting hit because everyone started working around it. People crammed cars into driveways, swapped spots with neighbors, and parked in the small public lot outside the main gate even though it meant walking in the heat. Compliance, yes. But not because we respected the board. Because we were done letting our guests get ambushed. The petition item was coming. The vote was coming. And I could tell the board was nervous, because management suddenly started sending helpful clarifications about parking that they'd never bothered with before. They even offered a temporary guest pass system, something Ms. K had rejected in the past as too lenient. That shift told me they were trying to defuse us before we got to the ballot. But at this point, it wasn't about a guest pass. It was about the board learning that power doesn't mean surprise punishment. It means trust. And they'd spent the last month burning that bridge like it was kindling. I had a plan forming, not wild or illegal or dramatic in the movie way, just strategic. Lawful. Plausible. The kind of plan that uses their own rules to reroute the whole machine. And I knew the real fight was about to start, because the petition vote wasn't the end. It was the opening for something bigger. As the meeting date crept closer, I could feel the social temperature rising. The board was about to face public embarrassment in front of the very neighbors they tried to scare into silence. And if they didn't back down, if they doubled down again, then my retaliation wouldn't just be about parking. It would be about making sure they never controlled this community like that again. I went to bed that night with the desert wind tapping lightly at my window screen, and a weird calm in my chest. Because now it wasn't me versus the association. It was the whole neighborhood deciding what kind of place we wanted to live in, and whether the people at that front table deserved to stay there. The week before the meeting felt like standing on a cracked lake bed waiting for thunder, dry air, bright sun, and attention you could taste even if no clouds showed up. Every evening the sky went watercolor pink, and every night the patrol SUV still rolled by with its muted engine and slower than normal crawl. But the vibe outside had shifted. People weren't shrinking anymore. They were coordinating. There were quiet driveway swaps, neighbors offering space to each other, little, text me if your guests need a spot, threads that made the board's fear tactic look kind of pathetic. I stayed steady. I didn't want to spike emotions too early. I kept tracking incidents, saving receipts, and filing every notice that came in. The new bold bulletin about immediate towing went into the evidence folder. The trash bin warning too. If they were going to play procedural chess, I was going to have the whole board photographed. Then, 3 days before the meeting, management emailed me a draft agenda. My petition item was there, tucked in the middle, labeled blandly like it wasn't the hottest issue in the neighborhood. Proposed parking enforcement moratorium and notice policy review. They tried to neutralize it with paperwork language. But the moment I saw it in black and white, I felt a strange kind of relief. Because now they couldn't wiggle out. They had to address it in public, on record, with homeowners watching. I sent a calm update in the group chat reminding everyone of the date, time, and the fact that the bylaws allowed homeowners to vote on policy changes by majority. I attached the relevant bylaw excerpt again, the kind of thing most people never read until they realize it's their seatbelt. I also asked, politely, for people to come in person if they could. Not to yell. Not to heckle. Just to be there. Presence is pressure. The night before the meeting, the patrol guy did another slow pass at 12:15 a.m. I watched from a dark window, listening to the soft rattle of wind against the porch light fixture, and I felt something almost like pity. Because he wasn't the real problem. He was a tool. The real problem was the board deciding that fear was cheaper than trust. And this is where things got real in a legal consequence way. If the board had ignored progressive enforcement, selectively towed guests, and then backdated their policy with that bold bulletin, they'd built a paper trail that could come back on them. I wasn't promising a lawsuit or giving advice, but they were about to realize that abusing power doesn't stay private once neighbors start documenting. I didn't say that to anyone. I just held the thought like a quiet blade. By morning, my sister had gone back home, and my driveway was empty again, clean, compliant, boring. The neighborhood looked calm on the surface. But underneath, it was rewired. The meeting night arrived with a sunset so bright it made the clubhouse windows look like they were on fire. People started filing in early, and you could feel the buzz in their steps, the whispered side conversations, the way everyone kept checking their phones like they were waiting for a drop. The air inside was cold from the AC battling the heat, and the fluorescent lights made everything feel a little too sharp. The board sat up front, same positions, same stiff posture. The chair looked more tired than usual, like he'd spent the week rehearsing arguments. Miss K wore that calm, pleased expression she always did, the one that says she expects to win before the game starts. Management kicked off the agenda. They moved through a couple small items, but nobody was listening. You could feel that collective patience thinning. People were here for one reason. When we hit the petition item, the room quieted so hard you could hear the air conditioner's rhythmic whine. Management read the petition summary. They noted the signature threshold had been met and that a homeowner vote was required. The chair took the mic and launched into a speech about safety, access, and how rules protect property values. Same script, different night. He said the immediate towing bulletin was a necessary clarification. He said the patrol had been instructed to act consistently. He said residents had long been aware of overnight parking limits. Then he opened the floor for homeowner comments. I stood first, not because I needed the spotlight but because I wanted to anchor the tone. I stayed calm and factual. I referenced the enforcement ladder clause, warning, notice, penalties, severe action, absent a safety emergency. I referenced the agenda excerpt from last month showing the board discussed a parking compliance initiative but didn't notify homeowners of a towing shift afterward. I referenced the timing of the bold bulletin arriving after multiple tows had already happened. No emotion. Just sequence. Then I asked for one thing, a moratorium on towing for overnight curb parking until a clear, written, community-wide notice period was completed, with a consistent progressive enforcement system. I sat down. And the room changed. Because one by one, neighbors stood up and basically backed that ask with their own stories. A visiting parent towed at 2 a.m. A brother's truck removed without warning. A guest with mobility issues forced to trek from the public lot in 100-degree heat because they were scared of a tow. Nobody shouted. They didn't have to. The sheer repetition of the pattern did the shouting for them. The treasurer tried to interrupt twice to keep comments brief, but management gently told her to let homeowners finish. That moment alone felt like a crack running through the board's certainty. Ms. K finally spoke. She leaned into the emergency argument again, narrow streets, blocked fire lanes, litigation risk, chaos. She said if towing went away, the neighborhood would spiral. And right after her, a retired paramedic stood up from the back row. He said he'd served on emergency response crews for decades and our streets were wide enough for full-size engines even with curb parking. He added that towing without warning wasn't a safety plan, it was punishment. Nobody clapped because it wasn't that kind of meeting. But the silence after he spoke was heavy and brutal in the best way. The chair's face tightened. He hadn't expected that kind of calm, credible pushback. Management then outlined the two options on the homeowner ballot. Option A, continue immediate towing enforcement as newly clarified. Option B, enact a 60-day towing moratorium for overnight curb parking, require a written notice period, and restore progressive enforcement with warnings first. Ballots were paper. Anonymous. Collected on-site or by drop-off within 5 days. 5 days. The chair tried to sound confident as he explained the voting timeline. But even through his practiced tone, you could hear a flicker of anxiety. Because he knew. Once power goes to the ballot, it stops being theater. The next 5 days were the most quietly intense week I've ever lived through. There weren't signs in yards. No dramatic rallies. Just a steady hum of doorbell conversations and text threads. The desert evenings cooled down to that soft, dry comfort zone, and people sat outside in folding chairs comparing notes, not about gossip but about what kind of community we wanted to be. I didn't campaign in a loud way. I didn't need to. I just made sure anyone who asked had the facts. I resent the evidence props to those who wanted to see them, the May 12th final notice, the enforcement clause, the bulletin email, and the agenda excerpt. I reminded people that this vote was about process, not personality. Even though we all knew personalities were involved. On the fourth day, management emailed a reminder that ballots were due by Friday at 5 p.m. The afternoon heat was thick and bright, and the reminder felt like a countdown clock ticking in a quiet room. The chair made one last attempt to sway people by posting in the app about property values and safety again. It backfired. Neighbors replied with polite, clipped lines about notice, consistency, and fairness. Miss K, for once, didn't reply at all. That silence told me more than any argument. She was watching her controls slip through her fingers and didn't know how to grab it without looking worse. Friday came. The mailbox down at the clubhouse filled up. I dropped my ballot in around noon. I didn't linger. I didn't need to see who else was there. The air smelled like sun-warmed stone and a faint trace of pool chlorine as I walked away. I felt this low, steady calm, the same calm you get right before an exam results post. You've done what you can. The rest is gravity. Management said they'd announce the results on Monday evening by email. So we waited through the weekend like we were waiting for a verdict. I didn't have any guests over, not because I was scared anymore, but because I wanted the board to have zero distractions. No excuses, no fresh examples for them to twist. Monday evening arrived with that purple desert dusk settling over the roofs. I was in my kitchen, the window open just enough to hear a distant sprinkler hiss, when the email notification hit my phone. I opened it. Option B1. And it wasn't close. A clear majority supported the moratorium, notice period, and progressive enforcement return. The email also noted a required policy review session would be scheduled within the 60-day window with homeowner input. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, letting it sink. Not because I didn't expect it, but because it felt so rare to see community power actually land cleanly. I walked outside. The street was still, warm air drifting past, and a couple neighbors were already out on their porches, phones in hand, nodding at each other in that small, satisfied way. The patrol SUV rolled by an hour later, slower than usual, then kept going. No stop. No photos. It was the first time in weeks it looked like a normal security loop. The board tried to spin the result as a temporary adjustment, but the shift was immediate. That night, a guest car was parked down the street. The patrol passed it and moved on. No sticker. No tow. The moratorium had teeth because it was backed by the bylaws and the vote, and management wasn't going to risk ignoring it after this public slapdown. 2 days later, the committee sent a formal notice outlining the new enforcement ladder, with a 30-day education period. Warnings first. Clear signage at entrances. An actual guest parking map. Everything they could have done in the beginning but refused to because fear was easier. What really surprised me was the tone. It was soft. Almost careful. Like they'd learned the neighborhood's mood could push back. Then, quietly, the real aftershock started. High summer election season was coming up, and homeowners had fresh motivation. People began talking about nominees, not privately in whispers but openly in threads and porch conversations. I didn't want to be on the board. I wasn't craving a seat at that table. But I did want the table to stop acting like it owned the house. Several neighbors asked if I'd help find candidates. So I did. I found 2 residents who'd been involved in the petition, both calm, community-minded, and allergic to power trips. One was a teacher who understood fairness in a way you can't fake. The other ran a small business and knew how to read budgets without turning every expense into a personal grudge. We helped them submit their nominations. We shared their bios. We kept everything respectful and policy-focused. When election day rolled around later that summer, the chair barely held his seat. One of our candidates won a position outright. Another position flipped to someone new. Miss K didn't run. She'd always framed herself as indispensable, but when the community mood turned, she vanished from the spotlight like someone switching off a lamp. The patrol guy stayed employed, but his role changed. He was instructed to leave written warnings for the first violation and to call towing only after repeated notices. The midnight blitz era was officially done. And because the committee had to run the policy review session, homeowners packed the clubhouse again. This time, not in anger, but in ownership. We clarified a simple overnight guest pass process and established a consistent street parking guideline that balanced safety with reality. It wasn't a revolution. It was governance, done right. The most satisfying moment for me wasn't the vote itself. It was the first family weekend after the new policy. My cousin came back out. He parked on the curb with a printed guest pass on his dashboard. The patrol SUV rolled by once, steady and normal, and kept going. No drama. No fear. Just a neighborhood choosing sanity. That night, we sat outside under the soft hiss of warm wind, the streetlights casting long shadows on the gravel. My cousin laughed and said it felt like the place finally exhaled. He was right. And I realized something I didn't expect to feel: pride. Not in winning against the board, but in watching neighbors who barely knew each other turn into a real community when it mattered. That's what a good HOA revenge story actually is, in real life. Not yelling or chaos, just people using the boring rules to protect each other from petty authority. Here's the deadline twist that made it stick: the board's 60-day moratorium clock forced them to show their work in public, and every day they dragged their feet was another day homeowners watched, ready to vote again, nominate again, and keep power from sliding back into the shadows. They learned the hard way that control without consent has an expiration date. In the aftermath, life got quieter in the best way. Still desert hot. Still dust on the windows by noon. Still the same pastel walls and mountain sunsets. But the emotional weather was different. Neighbors waved more. Not the performative wave, but the real one where people actually want to check in. Group chats stayed active, but now they were about helping each other, lending ladders, trading plant cuttings, warning each other about monsoon leaks. The committee meetings changed too. The chair was still there, but he'd lost the aura of inevitability. He spoke slower, listened more, and looked around the room before ending discussions. Management started sending clear notices ahead of any enforcement change. That alone felt like a victory bigger than parking. And me? I went back to being a normal homeowner who just wants my family weekends and my calm desert life. But with one difference: I kept the evidence folder. Not out of paranoia, out of respect for the lesson. Power behaves when it knows you're paying attention. Tell me your HOA horror in one line, especially the midnight rules kind.